Hi everyone. I'm Dermot, uh, Dermot Trainer. I'll be the instructor for your course in U.S. history since 1865 for this semester. But I suppose before I get kind of stuck into all the history and reconstruction and all the detail, I guess I'd better kind of introduce myself. Although I realise this is a really unusual format to do so. So actually, thanks everyone for kind of bearing with me as I'm still here in Ireland, although I fly out on Friday. So I mean, I talk to you now from the room in my house, office space in Belfast in Northern Ireland. Um, Passport due to get here tomorrow, and then I fly out to Kansas City and then on to Atchison on Friday. So all being well, I should actually kind of get the chance to meet you all in person next Monday, which I'm really looking forward to. Oddly enough, I suppose I've had a bit of experience with Kansas in the past, so it won't be completely unusual territory for me. I've been to Kansas City, I've been to Topeka, I've been to Pittsburgh, actually, in the little town in the southern part of the state. So actually, Atchison's probably one of the big urban areas I haven't been to. So I'm really looking forward to it. Yeah. So to give you a bit of more background about myself, I suppose my full name is Dermot Trainer, Dr. Dermot Trainer. I've born and raised in Belfast, and then went to a series of schools to study history in England. So I guess I studied at Durham University, and then I did my masters and my PhD at Cambridge University, and I just graduated there from Cambridge 6 weeks ago. So all still fairly fresh from that, and as you can tell from my accent, yeah, I'm not from around your parts. So I guess with that in mind, I should probably explain just a little bit about how, never mind how I got into history, but how I got it so into American history. That I'll be kind of the person with you this semester. So I mean, from my kind of early memories, or when I was like 5 or 6. Being in the centre of Belfast with my dad, going to see a speech by then President Bill Clinton, who had taken quite an active part in the Northern Ireland peace process. And then the next was in 2005 as kind of a follow-up from that. There was a visit to Northern Ireland, actually to my school of all places, from President George W. Bush. And so I didn't get to meet him, but I did get to see him make a speech in person. And then I was quite close, although he didn't come to Northern Ireland, I was in the Republic of Ireland, quite close to where Obama visited in 2009. And again, I was even also actually quite, I wasn't far away in Dublin a few years back when Vice President Mike Pence was passing through. So it might sound it might not sound very intuitive, but actually being from Ireland, especially Northern Ireland, America doesn't feel that far away, especially when American politicians, especially American presidents, kind of get so involved and have been so involved diplomatically. So I guess that probably explains why America kind of reached out to me. And then the other part of, I suppose, the puzzle is that I've got quite a lot of family in the States, aunties, uncles, cousins, grandparents, lots and lots in different parts, in Texas, in Massachusetts, in New York State, in Canada, and like Kingston, Ontario. So all of whom I've had the luck to go out and visit quite a few times. So I've been to the States back and forth quite a bit. So all that's in the back of my head, so that by the time I get to university, and I was lucky there as well that the people who taught American history at the universities I went to in England, I think were the coolest teachers. Certainly they were, yeah, I think so. And so, as I look back now, I realise that, from the age of 18 onwards, I've kind of been on a path towards American history all along. And suddenly, having just done a PhD in American history, I've found myself at the end of this process. And then here we are, with myself coming to Benedictine College. So yes, again, thanks for bearing with me, because I think I'm somewhat of a late appointment, and I come from afar. So I'd kind of hoped to have already been in Kansas City, in Atchison, by today to actually kind of for the start of semester. So at the very least, I'll be there shortly. It's just It's just how passport and visas and all that works. Sometimes, the U.S. Embassy and U.S. Immigration Services will do things by their own time, of course. So yes, no, I look forward to meeting you all next Monday. And today, of course, it is we are kind of at the beginning of our U.S. history since 1865. One other thing I should mention as well is, as you can tell, this is quite a kind of a low quality basic format. I'm really just speaking to you from a room today, but hopefully, when I kind of get to present to you next Monday, I'll have more visual aids. I have a little bit more to kind of light up the period of which I'm talking about, and obviously there'll be a lot more Q&A and a lot more interaction between us, so it'll be great. So so thank you for kind of putting up with this format for the moment, which really isn't ideal and is quite basic. So yes, Reconstruction, which is kind of the first block of time, which comes immediately after the Civil War, which ended, of course, in April of 1865. And Reconstruction is really kind of a defining period in American history, because so much of what happens after, in terms of civil rights, the definition of American citizenship, the rights of women, the rights of foreign immigrants, the rights of labourers, of course the rights of African Americans, and indeed the shape of both northern and southern societies. In this space immediately after the Civil War being such a huge conflagration, the societies of both North and South appear unusually molten at this time, and so much change happens in just these dozen years, which in many ways goes on to define the pathways of American history up to the present, and certainly and also in terms of the Constitution and the law. So before I kind of get stuck into the major and some of the minor detail of the Reconstruction era and its defining events, I guess I better give you just hopefully a visual snapshot of where the United States was in 1865, what the lay of the land was. So 1865, it's the end of 4 years of huge and horrendous civil war between the northern states and the southern states, of course, involving millions of men and women, both in different theaters of war militarily, but also in the kind of the home fronts, people moving to all different places within the Confederacy, within the northern states. The war has seen huge changes. Really kind of the decimation and crumbling of Southern society, of the Confederacy, and the fundamental structures of Southern society, the slave power. But it's also seen an equal revolution in Northern society, which has gone from more agricultural, small-holding farmers as the defining element, to one of giant industrial power brought on by the Civil War. The landscape, in other words, of both the North and the South is very changed. In the South, large areas are simply destroyed. In the North, suddenly towns have exploded in size. What were once fields were now factories. A huge change. You look at pictures of Charleston or Richmond to see the kind of the decimation of the South. Look at pictures maybe in 1865 of Pittsburgh and New York City and its environs to see kind of the huge industrial changes there. And kind of spanning out our view a little bit, simply away from like the north-south binary, kind of to look at the United States territory as a whole. There's also been remarkable change in the West during the war. The organization of new territories, new states. I guess the peopling first and foremost of California. The West now has, by the end of the Civil War, its first major city, which is San Francisco. Major cities like later on, like San Diego, Los Angeles, really these are still just kind of towns or hamlets almost. Salt Lake City would probably be a close second to San Francisco, being kind of peopled by Mormons during the 1840s and 1850s. But the West really is still quite wild, and certainly west of the Mississippi, outside of eastern Kansas, and the Missouri, it really still is the dominion of the Native American tribes, many of whom have been kind of forcibly relocated there in the decades before the Civil War. So the West is still very much the realm of the Comanche, the Cheyenne, in Oklahoma, the Cherokees, the Choctaw, the Seminoles, the Ute, the Napiers, the Modocs. So there's still an incredible number of kind of Native American empires, really, and kind of national areas of sovereignty. Although again, the Civil War has also seen unprecedented amounts of large-scale warfare between the Army in the West and Native Americans in Minnesota and in western Kansas, and of course in Colorado as well. So you can see the beginning of westward expansion has also started during the Civil War. So all told, kind of major change. So if kind of that's the big picture. If we now take for a moment and kind of zoom in on the populace who really were obviously at the centre of this conflict, insofar as slavery was at the centre of what the Civil War was about. You know, people talk about how the Civil War was about a struggle over states' rights vis-a-vis the power of the federal government, for instance, which expanded massively during the Civil War. But you might well argue states' rights over what? Well, the right by certain states to enshrine slavery into their laws for individuals who live in those states. So slavery really is it certainly becomes, as the war goes on, more and more the centre of the conflict. And of course, the only enslaved peoples, except for a few Native Americans in Florida, are the African Americans, who are at this period still mostly concentrated in the southern states, the Confederacy, now former Confederacy. So we take that kind of group of people. We're in the year 1865, April 1865. The first half, massive change of that month. So Richmond falls, Petersburg falls, Lee surrenders at Appomattox. And so there is kind of a state from in the summer of 1865 of kind of eerie anarchy throughout the South, where the former Confederate authority has collapsed, and you now have African Americans, of course, using their own freedom and initiative to begin to enact change. So you've got African Americans whose key demand is land ownership, as it was indeed for the whites who initially settled this land back in the 16 and 1700s, 1800s. Because land ownership, of course, was tied to being independent, which was tied to being free. So I guess the central demand for the formerly enslaved African Americans was that they own the land which for so many years and generations that they had tilled and laboured on, that was now their right. Of course, you had a white population feeling more vulnerable, more in fear, which obviously still held on to kind of racist beliefs about African Americans, and of course didn't want to give up their privileges. At the same time, though, this is an unusual period of initiative for African Americans because, come 1865, something like a quarter of the adult male able population has been killed or grievously wounded by the Civil War in the South. Famously in 1866, the Mississippi State Legislature spent something like 20% of its total budget just on artificial limbs. So there's a lot of men who are kind of out of action, and a lot of now former Union veterans back in the South, taking the initiative into their own hands. And so this is most clearly seen in the aftermath of Sherman's decimatory campaigns through Georgia and South Carolina in 1865, and I think his Special Field Order number 15, in which African Americans in the month of April and May 1865, in the areas under Sherman's command in Georgia and South Carolina, are each given 40 acres, and he also lends them some of his army's mules. Hence the famous phrase that kind of originated from this time, that African Americans were now demanding 40 acres and a mule as a consequence of the war. On top of that was their definition of freedom, as opposed to simply legal freedom without any resources or material. So at the same time, of course, in the same month of April 1865, just a few days after Lee surrendered at Appomattox, you have Lincoln's assassination, which of course is one of the great what-ifs of history. What would Reconstruction have looked like if Lincoln had survived? Instead, President Andrew Johnson takes over now, who was his vice president. We'll get on to him in a moment. For the moment, actually, now that we're on Lincoln, I just want to discuss a little about how Plans and visions for Reconstruction were first dreamed up really during the Civil War. So really it's in 1863, New Orleans, which of course is one of the great cities of the South, and lots of Louisiana, actually fall to the Union Army quite early in the war, as do the islands of South Carolina and other areas. And so the debate already over kind of what to do with the peoples of these areas once the war is concluded starts quite early here. And Lincoln basically had what he called a 10% plan, which was that, if basically he would ask that the local peoples, the voters of those states in the year 1860, if 10% of them signed on to an oath, a new oath of allegiance of the Union, they could then form their own state governments. And the only real prerequisite for then rejoining the Union was the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which had passed in January 1865, kind of outlawing slavery, except in punishment for crime. So that was kind of his quite moderate, conservative 10% plan. Another, in Lincoln's last speech before he was assassinated, he also kind of pointed to the fact that he planned to allow former black Union veterans, and who he called the very intelligent blacks, to be able to vote. This is in a speech of April 11th, 1865. So that was kind of Lincoln's, ultimately though Lincoln had quite a conservative and one might say lenient view of how to treat the South, and indeed, as he said in his second and final inaugural, how to bind up the nation's wounds. This was quite controversial, and so you had quite a powerful lobby of who were called radical Republicans, both during the war and after the war, who had this kind of grand vision of recreating the South in the image of the North. In other words, the South would also become a free Labour Republic, where everyone was equal before the law, and where everyone had the ability to engage in free labour, the right to make contract, the right to your own master, the right to engage in wage labour. Now, the most radical of these kind of radical Republicans, people like Charles Sumner, but even more than him, a congressman called Thaddeus Stevens, who you're probably going to come across quite a bit when you read about Reconstruction, a kind of a radical Republican from Pennsylvania. His grand scheme, as one of the leaders of the radical Republicans in Congress, was that the South kind of followed the Sherman Plan in confiscating most of the major plantations and land holdings of the especially former Southern elites, and redistributing that land to former slaves and some settlers from the North. So that was his intended plan. But that was really the limits of radical Reconstruction. Even most of his fellow radicals didn't want to go along with that, because the outer limits of radical Reconstruction in the North was still the quite conservative ideas about private property ownership and its sanctity. And that even if that property in question was the former property of slaves, it was still to be kind of not outright confiscated and redistributed, but to be negotiated with. So, in other words, and there was many moderates within the Republican Party who already felt, as it were, that the South and the Southern leadership, through the dint of the war itself and its devastating consequence, had already suffered enough. So that was the essential tension within the kind of moderate radicals within the Republican Party, of whom Lincoln was really more with the moderates, although who knows how he would have evolved politically as time had gone on. So that's really where kind of the northern plans were in 1865, and also kind of African American aspiration. Now, it was much broader than simply land ownership, but that was the real key. And then, of course, I think in the same year of 1865, we should get on, of course, to the opposition. And that was not just the Democrat Party in the North, but Democrats, white planters, various members of the white elite in the South, those who still survived and weren't named by the Civil War itself. And really, obviously, as you can imagine, they had to be forced through the war, through 4 years of very bloody warfare, to give up their right to slave ownership. So I guess you would describe the atmosphere of the white population in the South as scared in 1865, as scared, sullen, resentful, revengeful, not willing. I mean, although they no longer had the slave power, they certainly their kind of racist beliefs hadn't been altered by the war itself. And so, really, what they wanted to do was, to still essentially continue the Civil War in another form, if you will, and try to lessen the degree to which their cherished antebellum Southern society would be changed by the war. Um, and of course, they were much helped in this regard by John Wilkes Booth and his assassination of President Lincoln, because with the assassination of Lincoln was the ascension of President Andrew Johnson. And it's worth spending just a minute or two on Andrew Johnson as an individual, because in many ways he perfectly embodied a particular class in the South who were really key to how Reconstruction was going to pan out in the long term. So Andrew Johnson, born and raised in Tennessee, to poverty, a log cabin, just like Lincoln. But Andrew Johnson, on the other hand, of course, didn't just stayed in slave society, whereas Lincoln went north, Andrew Johnson went south. Always politically ambitious from an early age. Rose through the ranks, eventually getting to the U.S. Senate on the eve of the war, becoming governor of Tennessee. Incredibly, really was the only major Southern Confederate or Southern state politician at the outbreak of the Civil War who sided with the Union. And of course, this is really and then became quite a militant Tennessee war governor during the war. And this was really key for why Lincoln chose him as his VP in 1864 when he was worried about re-election. He thought a figure like Andrew Johnson, who was a unionist but quite a racist one, would kind of go down well in the border states that were always so prominent in Lincoln's thinking. Those states which still held slaves but which were members of the Union, like Kentucky, or at least hadn't sided against the Union. And so, Andrew Johnson himself, in the course of his rise in Tennessee society over the decades before the Civil War, was a small slaveholder. But as a man, as a politician, as someone who came from poverty, represented quite the embodiment of that white working class of the South, who, although they may have still share the same beliefs about African Americans as the Southern elite, very much still resented that same Southern elite and their overwhelming power over Southern society, as showcased by how they railroaded Southern society into a Confederate States of America and beginning the Civil War. So, so Andrew Johnson came into office, and it appeared that he was going to be quite radical in terms of he did not want to bind up the nation's wounds. Quite the opposite. He wanted, at first at least, it appeared to be quite harsh towards the former Southern elite who were involved in the war. However, it wasn't long, only really after the first month or two in office, this is now May into June 1865, when it became apparent that what Johnson wanted most of all was for his revenge was not to uplift African Americans, but rather instead to get those same Southern elites from all across the Southern states to have to petition him individually for an oath of pardon, and often have to come to the White House themselves and beg to be let back into the Union. And I think that really fundamentally satisfied Andrew Johnson's felt need for gratification, for revenge over the Southern elites, who he always resented before the war. But critically, he fundamentally agreed with those same elites in holding kind of deeply racist opinions about the potential for African Americans, about racial inequality in his case. Indeed, with all the class tension in Southern society, in antebellum Southern society, the idea that all white men and white women were on some level still equal over African Americans, that kind of racist glue is what kind of overcame class conflict in the South, and you see that playing out then with Andrew Johnson and how Reconstruction played out in 1865. So all Andrew Johnson wanted was to have the satisfaction of getting the former elites come to beg him in the White House, and then he granted them pardons. But not just that, he actually ordered that they have all their former lands returned to them. In Andrew Johnson's mind, because succession was illegal, the Southern states had never really left the Union, and therefore they had kept all their antebellum rights. As you can imagine, this conflicted directly with those African American aspirations I talked about earlier a few moments ago. So African Americans who had been given 40 acres and a mule by Sherman under his Order Number 15 in places like South Carolina, the islands off Sandwich Islands off South Carolina, other parts of Georgia. the agents of the North came to them and said, "I'm very sorry, but you're going to have to give your lands back." As you can imagine, this didn't go down very well. Indeed, it's that kind of the great retaking of lands which African Americans had taken in earlier in 1865 was remembered for decades and decades afterwards, because there was an argument, a very case to be made, really, that really it was in these months that major factors of Reconstruction were decided very early on, and as many African Americans put it in the decades later, that fundamentally radical Reconstruction, because of Andrew Johnson ultimately and the assassination of Lincoln, proved to be stillborn, insofar as we'll come to see, although African Americans were given the right to vote and had more and more political influence in the late 1860s, these rights actually proved quite vulnerable in a kind of deeply resentful racist South, when these black office holders were surrounded by Southern white society. And we'll get into the violence later on, but suffice it to say that fundamental power shift that would have occurred if African Americans if there had been a revolution in land ownership, which really would have fundamentally shifted power. There's a case to be made that ultimately the limits of Reconstruction were defined there and then, because as we'll see, I mean, once their political rights were once again taken away from them, due to the violence of the counter-revolution, the white counter-revolution of Reconstruction towards the end. Ultimately, at the very end of this whole process, into the 1880s, 1890s, and then into Jim Crow, African Americans were left working often on the same pieces of land which they had worked on before slavery, often on the same plantations. They might now have owned little parcels of that land. They might now, but generally speaking, their former masters, by and large, still owned the land. They might have escaped a lot of the white overseers and close supervision that came with antebellum gang labor slavery, but however, they were still forced essentially to give a lot of their product, a lot of their profit, to their master, or whom they were often still indebted to. So you can see they became to be known as the sharecropping system. So you can see that fundamental dynamic, which actually Karl Marx highlighted in 1865 as that which needed to be changed in order to give African Americans power. That unfortunately didn't occur, and in many ways that it becomes a critical piece in how Reconstruction then plays out. So we have so that's a lot of the big events that take place in the year of 1865. From then onwards, Congress meets again in December of 1865 after a long recess, really trying to do the bad work of Andrew Johnson and his presidential Reconstruction, which had taken place from April to November of 1865. What happens in 1866, 1867 is Congress passes a Civil Rights Act, an act to extend the Freedmen's Bureau, which is a federal agency which attempts to uplift some African Americans in terms of education and also oversee race relations in the South in the aftermath of the overthrow of slavery. The Freedmen's Bureau exists from 1865 to 1870. Then we've got, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is significant as a forerunner to the 14th Amendment, insofar as for the first time it defines the freedoms that come with American citizenship. And then in 1867, along with the Military Reconstruction Act in March of 1867, because of the obstinacy of Andrew Johnson, who basically won't work with Congress, ever more moderates become radicalized, and essentially Congress itself becomes more and more radical as the 1860s goes on, with a peak really in March of 1867, where the southern states, the 11 former southern states that made up the Confederacy, are split into 5 military districts. So they're not admitted to the Union yet. The Congress forbids that, even though Andrew Johnson wants it. They're split into 5 different military districts, with a lot of power given to each military governor. I mean, and this does lead to some revolutionary change, of course. So African Americans all across the South are now, black men anyway, are given the right to vote. And if you have some quite radical Republican military governors like General Sheridan, who ran the 5th district, which covered Texas and Louisiana, in places like New Orleans, he forced integration, which was remarkable. So in the same sites where you had slave pens just a few years before, you now had blacks and whites integrated in the schools of New Orleans and the public transport of New Orleans. So you still had quite revolutionary change. And then black Thanks to the at least some army protection that was given to blacks across the South, you had fairly free and fair elections. There was a lot of violence in certain areas, but by and large, in the late 1860s, early 1870s, fairly free and fair elections for black men across the South, and a consequence, a whole generation, hundreds and thousands of black male office holders were elected across the South in these years, both at the municipal level, at the state level, especially somewhere like South Carolina, where all of a sudden the state legislature was majority black due to the majority black population of the state, or the number of black men. And then you also had alternately 14 congressmen, both senators and House of Representatives congressmen, black representatives in Washington D.C. over the course of Reconstruction. And these people had a huge influence in bringing all sorts of change to the South in these years. So the kind of the black radical Republican governments in places like Louisiana, South Carolina, Mississippi, really, whereas a tiny percentage of African Americans before the Civil War could read or write or had any education whatsoever. By the end of Reconstruction, black populaces in those states were close to 50% literate, which was an incredible change in the amount of time we're talking about. And this, in some ways, was helped by the North. You had a lot of religious figures, a lot of missionaries, a lot of members of the Freedmen's Bureau, who came, Northerners who came south to kind of try and help uplift African Americans in this time. And as that language suggests, there could often still be quite a condescending, paternalistic attitude or patronizing attitude by Northerners to Southern African Americans. But nevertheless, with their help, there was huge changes in the kind of literacy and education of the black population in the South, which would then go on to have huge changes as the decades progress, eventually resulting in the Civil Rights Movement. Because at this very same time, you had the emergence of powerful, independent black institutions, not just black schools, black universities, the black church, which had always been kind of a core institution for many African American communities before the war, but now really which came into its own after the war. A lot of black politicians came from the black church. The black church was a way to mobilize whole African American communities around given political issues or voting the Republican ticket. So certainly in realms of places like education and also in economics, I mean, black radical Republican legislatures in the South in the late 1860s, 1870s played a large role in the railroading of the South. Lots of new railroads, new urban industry. Although the Southern economy was now completely secondary to the Northern economy and was in many ways decimated, especially in agriculture, there was still significant urban development in the South in these years, and industrial development as well, which many of these black radical Republican legislatures played a key part in providing the income for through higher taxes, which would again become kind of the rallying cry of the kind of racist white redeemers who wanted to overthrow these governments. In other words, that they were kind of high tax socialist regimes. Socialist being a word that was already in use at this period of time after some of the revolutions that had taken place in Europe earlier in the century, and the Communist Manifesto, of course, which was published in 1848. So huge change, really, despite all that they were up against by these southern black governments. Now, the opposition really also was key to defining Reconstruction and its limits. So you have the beginnings. I mean, there's kind of already what is described as a reign of terror in many parts of the South in 1865. In fact, I would read Carl Church's report to Congress on this because it's remarkable in some of the violence it describes. But it's in many ways it's anarchic, unorganized terror by whites in the South. It's really in 1866 onwards through the late 1860s that more organized forms of anti-black violence come to the fore. So famously, of course, in the same state that Andrew Johnson was from, in Pulaski, Tennessee, was the founding of what became the KKK in 1866. Although there are many of these groups throughout Reconstruction, the KKK only becoming the most famous and arguably the most widespread. So it really kind of attempts to intimidate, attempts to outright kill and do away with or exterminate powerful blacks and the black population at large, especially in places like Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina. really came to the fore in the 1860s and 1870s with waves of violence, normally around election time. Now, more often than not in these years, the Federal Army, which was largely demobilized but which still had some units, was able to provide some protection to African Americans against such things, against such essentially guerrilla raids, often by former Confederates in these organizations. But really, as we'll see, as the 1870s progresses, the Reconstruction is in many ways also a test of Northern racial tolerance and patience and opinion. So, as Reconstruction as a project demands more and more money from Northern legislatures, from the Northern federal government, higher taxes, the Northern people themselves, although of course nearly all of them have never been slaveholders, but they still held many of the same kind of racialized beliefs about African Americans and their abilities, their potential, racially unequal beliefs. Were often convinced to essentially prioritize their own projects in the North over helping African Americans in the South and the money that required. And so we'll see, especially when depression hits, economic depression in the North in 1873, in those years immediately after, we see a real waning of Northern interest and a willingness to help continue radical Reconstruction or even moderate Reconstruction projects in the South. And so that becomes really key, especially for the idea of free labour freedom in the North is really centred around the ballot. And so once the 15th Amendment is ratified in January of 1870, a lot of Northerners, even a lot of radical Republicans, consider their job done. In other words, even though land hasn't been redistributed, African Americans are now wholly citizens, as they would see it, and should be able to fend and care for themselves, which is really a complete misunderstanding of the sheer levels of hostility and racial anger which so many African Americans faced in the South from their former owners, who had in many cases lost everything financially as a consequence of the war. So yes, that was the kind of the free labour aspect of it. I've talked a bit about the Black South and Reconstruction and all that Black African Americans achieved. And I've talked a little bit about kind of the white backlash, but I also within the time we have here today, I also kind of want to talk about Reconstruction as a stampede, an opportunity seen by many groups, not just African Americans, as an attempt to reform, reshape U.S. society writ large to become more equal. I mean, a majority of even Northern opinion, probably right up until the Civil War, would have been happy with the statement that ultimately the United States was, quote, a white man's society. Indeed, of course, that was the Northern Democrat campaign slogan of 1868. But now with the Civil War, with the kind of at least half revolution that it wrought for African Americans, was seen quite clearly by other marginalized and discriminated groups as an opportunity, as a chance for them. Number one in this list, of course, is women. And in some ways, what occurred legally and constitutionally with Reconstruction and African Americans in giving black men the vote in 1867, then confirmed in 1870, only kind of made more obvious, if you will, the gender discrimination aspect, both in the U.S. Constitution and in many states, and in many state laws and municipal laws between men and women. And so this was really a key period for women suffragists who did a lot of campaigning in this era, and not just in Washington D.C. but also in states, and with some success. States in the West, or territories at least in the West, like Wyoming famously in 1869, got through women's suffrage, albeit perhaps for somewhat self-interested reasons. But this was so the fact that African American men were given the ballot in 1867, 1870, really also rent a key divide in the progressive anti-slavery coalition of the pre-war years, because figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony were quite resentful of the fact that after all their work with abolitionists in the pre-war years on behalf of African Americans, that they also expected to receive the ballot in the late 1860s at some point. And so really this leads to the formation of the first, at least in the North, national women's suffragist party movement group, the NSSA, headed up by Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. So certainly at least the women's ballot gained a lot more public prominence and discussion in this time. You'll check out figures, for instance, like Victoria Woodhull, who was kind of a remarkable figure in New York society for supporting women's rights, not just for the ballot, but for other issues, and for also being radical in other ways. There was also kind of a movement during Reconstruction, a radical movement for foreign immigrants. There had been a lot of nativism in antebellum Northern and Southern society, but especially Northern society, in right up to the years just preceding the Civil War. Think of the 1850s, think of the Know Nothing movement, who you may have heard of, which were really in favour of limiting immigration, vastly extending the number of years an immigrant needed to apply to become a US citizen. And so this movement really in the Reconstruction era was centered around trying to eliminate the word white from the Naturalization Act of 1790. This was a project spearheaded by Charles Sumner in 1870, and really centered around the fact that the great immigration debate of the Reconstruction era was, in the minds of Northerners, what to do with the Chinese. There had been many Chinese who had always arrived in California, primarily San Francisco, from 1848 onwards, from the Gold Rush era. And there were now tens of thousands of Chinese in California. In fact, in 1870, they made up something like 1/5 of Wyoming territory, so there's really significant populations. About 1/4 as well of, or at least 1/8 of the population of Nevada territory as well in 1870. So, or Nevada State, eventually as it came to be known. So there's really significant populations now of Chinese arriving in ever greater numbers on the West Coast. And so they also get caught up in the great debate about race inequality in 1870. And of course a great debate takes place in the Senate on the 4th of July, 1870, which unfortunately, Charles Sumner loses his attempts to essentially enshrine the same rules for all immigrants from all over the world that arrive in the United States, Chinese included. So that's also part of the battles in Reconstruction. A third major constituency in Reconstruction that really came to the fore during the Civil War, obviously with the changes wrought in Civil War Northern society, was the labour movement. Reconstruction saw the first national labour movement organised in US history. Before the Civil War, there of course had been organised labour, but really they were concentrated in quite developed urban areas like New York City or Philadelphia. Now you had a labour movement that spanned across the entirety of Northern society, all the way from New York State to Michigan, Illinois. I mean, towns and cities like Detroit, Chicago, as a consequence of the Civil War, in large part, St. Louis, had become major industrial hubs in their own right now. And so now you had kind of a mass white working class that had been created as a consequence of the Civil War, and which also really challenged free labour precepts about what the Civil War was about. I mean, famously, Lincoln wanted to preserve the Union in some sense as it was during the Civil War. And that was, in his definition, as he gave a speech in 1859, that wage labour was not a permanent condition, was only a way station for the kind of poor working class in the North on their way to independent property, land, and financial wealth as their careers progressed, in the same way that Lincoln's career had progressed. But now, of course, as a consequence of the war and the rise of a mass industrial North, with huge factories, and with the emergence of what appeared to be now a permanent proletariat in the North, a proletariat being, I suppose, a body of workers for whom it was unlikely they would ever escape that particular station. In other words, that the wages they were paid, unfortunately, it would take many years, probably more than their life expectancies, to accumulate the sufficient capital to escape that wage labour status, if that makes sense. So now you have kind of a major white working class in the North that has completely altered Northern society, and so you see now there's major strike movements in the North that go along with radical Reconstruction, It primarily, of course, there's a major general 8-hour strike for the 8 hours in Chicago in 1867, and there's the 8-hour movement which spreads across the North in the late 1860s. This was a movement that really demanded that the average wage labourer only work 8 hours a day. The 40-hour work week, Monday to Friday, because the average wage worker, especially during the Civil War, at a time of such busyness, often worked 10, 11, 12 hours a day, sometimes 13, 14. In addition, often labouring alongside, if there are if there are women or men in these factories, often labouring alongside their children, because another major demand of the labour movement at this point, not yet established on a national basis, and wouldn't be for a long time, was child labour laws. So there's kind of huge kind of revolutions in society taking place in this period. Back though, I think, to kind of the focal point, that the famous focal point of Reconstruction, which was African American status. So in some ways, by 1872, there had been huge progress made by African Americans. Part of that, of course, was political influence. They had elected Ulysses S. Grant in 1868. They were key to that presidential victory in that year. They had re-elected him in 1862, and for as much as he was a sympathetic president who wished to protect them with the use of the army, of course, he was commander-in-chief. He was also former general of the armed forces. As time went on, Grant was also politically sensitive to Northern opinion, and so that army protection, that federal protection, that was really critical to African American advancement in the South and safety, because obviously the southern states weren't, and the southern state militias weren't going to provide that protection when many of themselves were former Confederates. That lessened as time went on, and there's a few kind of decisive moments in this. Really, of course, the Louisiana, New Orleans counter-revolution in September 1874, when essentially the state government is overthrown by force by former Confederates. That's September 1874. Eventually, belatedly, the army does move in on Grant's orders by January 1875 to re-establish kind of radical, or at least Republican control of the state and some black political influence. But this causes such a furore in the North, with Northern voters no longer wanting to get involved in Southern affairs, that Grant is then very reticent about the next major attempt to overthrow a black Republican Reconstruction, which takes place in Mississippi in 1875. And in that case, then, Grant and the army don't come to the rescue, and Mississippi, the kind of black Republican state government there, is very bloodily overthrown in 1875, so-called the Mississippi Plan, which is then rolled out again in the following year for South Carolina in 1876. So, to give you a kind of a bit of a broad picture, I mean, all the southern states kind of have ratified the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and are readmitted to the Union in 1870. But then, over the course of the next half dozen years, from 1870 to 1876, one by one, these different former Confederate state governments then are redeemed by former Confederates. First in places like Georgia, then Texas, Tennessee, arguably the earliest, North Carolina. So the kind of the holdouts towards the end of the Reconstruction era are those three black majority states: Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina. By 1876, really all the others have been overthrown, and so those are kind of the three citadels of black Republican power, which are overthrown through overwhelming, illegal, incredible, horrific, white Southern violence, organized, but equally by the northern public opinion, as expressed through a president who didn't send the army to protect African Americans, which could have been in the past was shown to be quite easily done. Whenever the Northern Army arrived in these states to break up, white political terrorism, that actually proved to be very easy to do once the army arrived. Generally these kind of the KKK and the Klan and all the other groups in their masks would run for the hills as soon as the actual army turned up. So it's very sad, really, how Reconstruction ended, and ultimately then just before to finish for today, it is the compromise, so-called compromise of 1877, where there's a split election, a very close election in November of 1876, in large part because so many of the southern governments, formerly black Republican, have now been violently overthrown. And so there's a real north-south divide again, and that's reflected in this incredibly close election, where there's a lot of argument back and forth over its legality and corruption within the election, eventually which results in a compromise with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes in March of 1877. But the compromise is the election of another Republican president after Grant. In return, that the army now completely leave the southern states, because there had still been some army in South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana. Now the demand was the federal army effectively leave the southern states completely, and that there be no further northern meddling in southern affairs, i.e. that the former Confederates had redeemed these states and could return race relations as they saw to as close as possible to its former state. And in the next lecture we'll get on to the birth of Jim Crow and in the late 19th century into the 20th century and its development, which becomes key to learn about as we then get on to the demands of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So thanks for bearing with me. There's a lot of history to cover in Reconstruction in 50 minutes. And so if you have any questions, please just let me know. And also I should say, I think in the syllabus, if I'm correct, it's in Eric Foner's Give Me Liberty and Voices of Freedom. Please do read, I think, chapter 15, if I recall correctly, which is the chapter which deals with Reconstruction, which I hope you all still will have available soon enough, if you can. So we'll leave it there today. So basically, in broad terms, Reconstruction was this grand half revolution that brought about real change, but was also really rolled back, but which, as we'll see in the weeks ahead, still had a positive legacy in the memories of African Americans in later generations, and therefore arguably had a part to play in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, a century later, which some African Americans called the Second Reconstruction. So I think we'll leave it there for today. Thanks for kind of taking a listen, because I know this whole situation with me just speaking into a microphone and not actually meeting you in person isn't ideal. So thanks very much. I'll post another lecture, of course, for Friday to do with Jim Crow, but then happily I am flying on Friday, so I will hopefully see you all in person on Monday, and I really look forward to it. So until the next lecture, thanks very much.